Okay, I'm Mark Peterson with the Utah Farm Bureau, and been involved in this for quite a while. And so what we're going to talk about now, as Rhonda said, let me get the clicker here, is Don talked about different kinds of permits. There's the CAFO permit, there's the CAFO permit by rule, and there's a AFO permit by rule. Do you need one of these? Would it be advantageous to you and your operation to have one or not? These are questions that I'm sure you're going to be asking yourself if you're not already. So we're going to go through some a kind of a risk assessment questions that you would ask yourself if to decide whether do I really need a permit or not. And it's kind of a risk assessment for you that you go through just to what's your risk and what's your exposure. That can help you decide. So we're going to go through just some of the questions that you might ask. Do you have a potential to pollute? That's a biggie. If you do, you might consider getting a permit by rule, or, you know, if you're not a large CAFO, and in my opinion, if you're not a large CAFO and fairly close to water, or have a situation where there's a pretty good risk of having pollution from your place, and you say that you want one of these full-blown CAFO permits, we can help you get psychiatric treatment if you'd like. We can help line that up. I can't see why anybody would want that permit unless you have a situation where you're a large CAFO, maybe you've had a runoff and discharge in the past, you have a high risk of runoff. So this is a big question to ask. Another one is how many animals do you have and how long are they confined? If you're a real small operation, a little small feed lot, you confine them for 50 days or something, your risk is a lot less than if you're a 5,000 cow feed lot, a beef feed lot of 5,000, or a dairy with 1,500 cows, and they're there for 365 days. It's just a lot more risk. The bigger you are and the more you confine them, the more manure there is to deal with. So that's a big question. Another question you might ask is how close are you to water? The closer you are to water, the higher the risk that you might have a discharge. If you're a long ways from water in a small operation, probably pretty low risk. So these are questions you ask yourself to assess your risk. What are the beneficial uses of the water? If you're in a drinking water source protection area, you probably got a higher exposure and a higher risk that somebody's going to look at you pretty close than if the water is a drain ditch that goes out to a duck pond and that's its only use. So the difference of beneficial use can increase your risk of exposure. Have you had a 24-hour, 25-year storm event? If you've had one of these big events, an event this size or larger, and you didn't have any discharge, no runoff from your facility, you're probably pretty low risk. Probably pretty good chance that you don't have but much risk of exposure there. What are the risks of runoff leaving your property onto a road right-of-way? Road right-of-ways, if it's running off onto road right-of-way, these are waters of the state usually, or quite often they are if it runs anywhere. Also, that's pretty visible. People driving by. If it runs across the road and somebody hits it with their new Cadillac or Lincoln and they think it's toxic waste, you're liable to get a complaint against you. We've had some of those. So, One fellow called EPA back in Washington, D.C. and said a farmer had put toxic waste on the road. And he'd hit it with his new car and had destroyed his automobile. I told him to run it through a car wash. Is it going on to a neighbor? Now, discharge just going on to a neighbor, it isn't going into a water of the state, may not be an illegal discharge, but it can, if the neighbor doesn't like it, it can increase your exposure for a complaint. Into a stream. If runoff leaves your property into a stream, you've got some exposure there and some pretty high risk. You maybe consider doing something about it. Have you corrected any problem? A lot of you have worked with NRCS. You've been participating in the program here in Utah. We've been going for 11, 12 years now, and a lot of you have already participated, and you've got systems designed to a 25-year, 24-hour storm event. If you've had cost share or you've worked with NRCS, they've designed it to a 25-year, 24-hour storm event. That's the standard. Okay, and if you've already got that, we used to think you were okay. EPA in their new rule says that any discharge from any size storm event from an unpermitted facility is illegal. It's an illegal discharge. So that created some problems for us and you folks that have participated in the program. And so the state has helped us in our partnership with the state. They've helped us by coming up with this permit by rule, and that's the reason that they've developed it, is so that we can get around this. If you have a big storm event, bigger than a 25-year, 24-hour storm event that your system's designed for, and you have a discharge, you can be a permitted facility by the permit by rule. That can bring you in and to being permitted and give you some protection against those large storm event discharges. So if you're in this situation, you might consider that permit by rule. It was developed for you. That was the main reason for it. Have you received cost share? If you have, you've got a system that's designed to a 25-year, 24-hour storm event, if it was federal cost share. How confident do you feel that you're in compliance with the CAFO rule? If you feel really confident that you're in compliant, that you are compliant with the rule, you might consider the permit by rule if there's a chance that you might have a discharge so that you stay in compliance. If you have any questions on any of this, how close are you to your neighbors? This increases your risk of a complaint if you're close to neighbors, especially if they're not farm neighbors. This sign, you probably can't read it, but it says, caution, developers, builders, and buyers. This is a working dairy. It produces flies, offensive odors, and noises at all hours. This dairy is going to be here for a while. If you don't like the smell, don't build here. Lazy Acres. I kind of like that sign, but they've built there anyway. So they must have decided they like the smell. Now, if you're in an ag protection area, that really helps because it gives you some protection against these nuisance complaints. And to be right honest, a lot of the complaints that come in for water quality are nuisance complaints. That's what triggers it. They don't like the flies, they don't like the smell. You're in an ag protection area, so they can't do anything about that. So they look for something else they can get you on. And so they'll complain about some water quality things. If you give them some reason to complain, it'll come. So that raises your risk considerably if you've got close neighbors and subdivisions right by you. How well do you get along with your neighbors? One of the things that you can do to help get along with these city neighbors that are moving out into the country is have a clean, well-managed operation. If it looks good, they're less likely to complain than if it's an eyesore. Have you had any pollutants run off from your property? If you have had, and you got these neighbors close by, they're going to be watching for it to happen again, and they'll complain. Have you received any complaints in the past? We have an arrangement with Don that if he gets a complaint, he has to respond to complaints. That's just one of the things he has to do. You get a complaint against you, and he'll call one of us at Farm Bureau. There's 3 of us work on this. Howard Thomas, where are you, Howard? He's in the back there, and a lot of you know him. He's been out to your place. The UACD folks, where are you? Let them know. Who? Are you the only one here? You got a big job. But Nathan, most of you probably know Nathan. One of us will go with Dawn out to look at it, address a complaint. It's an arrangement we have so that somebody from the agriculture is represented in looking at your complaint. And I'll just tell you, if on the first complaint, it's probably not, unless it's really egregious, it's not too hard to talk Dawn into being a little bit lenient. Second complaint, it gets harder, and you don't want to have any after that. It really gets tough to negotiate not having an enforcement action if there's repeated complaints, if they're legitimate complaints. How close are you to urban areas? We've kind of covered that. How close are you to major highways? This increases your exposure. If you're right on a highway that a lot of environmentalists and animal rights activists drive down past your place, you've got a lot higher risk than if you're out on a country road that only your neighbors, farmers, drive by. I've jokingly said that one of the worst locations you could possibly be is on the highway that Don drives every day when he goes to work, especially if you're having a discharge problem. We've got a dairy that he drives by, and we've had to remind him to not give him a reason to complain about you or think there's a problem. Do you have an NMP, a Nutrient Management Plan? And we throw these acronyms out. NMP, when we throw that out, and there's going to be a whole presentation on it, but that's a Nutrient Management Plan. And do you have one? If you do, and you're operating by this plan, following it, you know what it is, and it's working for you, you're following it, keeping your records, and then you have a discharge, you're a lot better off if you are following your nutrient management plan. I can't stress that too much. That's the best friend you've got if somebody complains about you or you have a discharge. And you're following your plan and you're keeping your records, that's your best defense. So I really stress that, and we'll have a whole couple presentations talking more about that. How good are you at keeping your records? Again, this is part of the nutrient management plan, and the records are really important. If you get a situation where they're looking at possible enforcement action or something, and your records are all up to date, and you got records of everything that in your nutrient management plan says you're supposed to keep records on, you're a lot better off. If some of that's missing, you'll wish you had it. Okay? If you get in a situation where there's potential action, you got to have these records. Did you hear the question is what constitutes a discharge? And what's the difference between runoff from a pasture or corrals? EPA, well, Congress, when they passed the Clean Water Act, defined 2 different kinds of pollution. Point source, that you can point your finger at and say, I can see that. It comes out of a pipe or a ditch or something. That's a point source. And then they define non-point source that all the rest of the world calls diffuse pollution. But Congress chose to call it non-point. And that is diffuse pollution. It comes from off the pastures. If it's running off from a pasture or just sheet flow off from a feedlot that's not, just a working corral, it's not 45 days or more, it might be pollution, but that's non-point source. Runoff from fields, these are considered non-point. But Congress in their wisdom defined CAFOs as point sources in the law. And so EPA has no choice but to treat CAFOs as point sources. And they've defined that, a CAFO, as being the large ones or medium ones or small ones that have a discharge. That are discharging. They can require them to have a permit. That's why those come under the permit. Point sources are permitted, discharges. You have to have a permit. And that's kind of the difference. Does that answer your question? Now, a discharge. What is a discharge? Where does it draw the line? It draws the line if you've got a corral that you contain animals in for 45 days or more. That's an AFO. That meets the definition of an AFO. If they're feeding them in there and it doesn't raise crops, or you're not raising forage or crops on the area that they're in. Now, proximity to water got something to do with your risk, and whether you might need a permit or not. It's any discharge of a pollutant. If water that's been in contact with your manure or your animals goes into waters of the state, that's a discharge. And there's nothing about amount. Now, amounts might come into play as to whether Don takes an action or not, or has to take an action, okay? That'll come into play there, but a discharge is any amount. Yes, question here. Okay, if it stays on your property, it's not a discharge. If it goes into a ditch that you use on your place, none of it leaves your place. It goes into your irrigation system and it doesn't leave your place, it's not a discharge. If it goes into a ditch, irrigation ditch, that leaves your place and goes to a neighbor downstream, it's a discharge, because that becomes waters of the state when it leaves your place. And the reason they've defined waters of the state so broadly, or so tight, I might say, is to include everything, is, the reason they've defined the waters so tightly is because the downstream water user has a right to not have polluted water, has a right to have it meet its beneficial use. And so the state the waters of the state's defined that way to protect us from what's happening upstream. So that we just kind of have to live with that broad definition. We got a question right here. If you're feeding them out on a pasture, the part of the definition of an AFO is the regulatory definition is that it's not growing forage or crops. That's still, you're feeding them out on a pasture. That's not an AFO. Okay, and runoff from that might be a problem, but it's non-point source and doesn't come under the permitting regulatory. The non-point source program is voluntary, incentive-based. Are we concerned about pollution from non-point? Of course. Absolutely, but it doesn't come under the regulatory permitting program, okay? There are if it's deep. What if you're you have it bermed and it's you have a collection pond, you're capturing it in a collection pond, and then it subs or goes into the ground. That could, if you've got a shallow water table, could be affecting it, but the groundwater are waters of the state. This rule applies to surface water, and that could be a concern if it's, and if it's deep, if it's a deep pond over 2 feet deep, then there are some regulations come in and it should be lined and so forth. But if it's a shallow evaporation pond, that's not regulated. Yes?
You have an area of concern. How long do you have to become compliant? You know what I mean? Like, how do these rules come into effect if you need to be building sediment ponds and things of that nature? How do we, as dairymen, get that accomplished?
We should have been in compliance about 1972, but EPA hasn't been really after us until about 12 years ago. That's why we started the programs, because they started targeting animal feeding operations. EPA says you should have been in compliance already. Our state has given us a window of opportunity and working with us on it. We're supposed to be in compliance now, but Don, help me out here. If they've got an issue and they want to come into compliance, how long have they got? If the problem's really bad, you better get on it real quick, because you're hanging out there, okay? We had a window of opportunity of about 5 years, and they extended that a little bit. That's gone by, but we know that there's still some things need to be done. That's why we're still doing this, okay? And they've changed the rules on us as well, so yes. And there's your man right there. Go see him. He'll come out, look at it. Or if you'd like to have Howard come out and look at it, they work in this area, and we don't report you to any regulatory outfit. We'll work with you, help you assess your situation, and come up with some solutions, potential solutions for you. You decide what to do and assess your risk and go from there. But they can help you with all that, okay? Yeah. Any other questions? Way in the back. Just about everything, and it's in your book. If you'll look, where is it in that book? It's in the blue book. He's holding up there.
The blue book on the inside.
Right on that, right just about in the front of that book is a definition statement. But it's about any water, and the reason they've defined it that way is because they want to protect and adjudicate and everything, all the water of the state. So it's pretty broad. Any other questions? Yes, right here.
That's shut down.
Absolutely. Well, we're trying to get it.
But just because
We're trying to get it so we can still apply in the winter. Well, hopefully we haven't give up our rights, but that just increases your risk that you're going to have a complaint. You're more visible. That's what I'm getting at. Is you're more visible. If we're more visible, though, we better comply with the laws. The laws and regulations are there, and if we're not complying, we're hanging ourselves out at a big risk. That's the point. Yes. Not me. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it, but if this rule stands, I mean, if this 590, it's a standard of NRCS, and we'll talk more about that, but Utah we've had a tool that's been approved that we've been using for 10 to 12 years here in Utah. It's a risk assessment tool that assesses the risk of runoff from a field. And we've been using that here in Utah. Most states, there's only 3 states that allow manure to be applied during the winter anyway, and we're one of them. And we're fighting hard to keep that. Yes.